Colleagues, dear friends, good afternoon. I'm very happy to see you. And we're going to hear the statement by Bank of Russia Governor Elvira Nabiullina in follow-up to Board of Directors meeting on 24th of October 2025. Good afternoon. Today we have made the decision to cut the key rate to 16.5% per annum. The situation has been developing generally in line with our forecast. Monetary conditions remain tight, fostering disinflation. Therefore, we have made the decision to continue monetary policy easing. At the same time, significant pro-inflationary risks have materialized since the previous meeting. They are primarily associated with an increase in the budget deficit in 2025 and higher fuel prices. In September, a decline in underlying inflation measures paused. The expected increase in taxes will help bring inflation down over the medium-term horizon, but will also lead to a one-off rise in prices in the short term. We have factored this into our decision, first by reducing the pace of monetary policy easing, and second, by revising upward the projected key rate path required to bring inflation back to 4%. I would now dwell on the reasons behind our today's decision. Firstly, inflation. Current price growth rates were up in September, which was primarily attributed to the dynamics of petrol and vegetable prices. Let me remind you that we observed an unusually early and considerable seasonal decline in fruit and vegetable prices in the summer period. In the autumn, they resumed growth earlier than usual. A change in the seasonal trends in vegetable prices and tightness in the fuel market are temporary factors that have led to an acceleration in current price growth. However, even if we strip these and other transitory factors from inflation, its underlying measures are still above 4%. They are not demonstrating a sustainable downward trend. Most measures of underlying inflation have remained in the range of 4 to 6% for several months already. Inflation expectations stay high. In October, companies' price expectations even increased after remaining virtually unchanged for several months. They were mostly up in trade. Businesses explained this increase by the expected rise in taxes, among other factors. Households' inflation expectations remained unchanged in October. In the updated forecast, the inflation rate projected for the next year has been raised to 4-5%. This is attributed to temporary pro-inflationary factors, including the situation in the fuel market, the rise in taxes, as well as the indexation of utility tariffs at a higher rate. According to our estimate, these factors will continue to pass through to prices until mid-2026. Underlying inflation will return to 4% in H2 2026. In 2027 and beyond, annual inflation will remain at the target. Secondly, the economy. According to recent data, its growth decelerated in Q3 25. Dynamics remain uneven across sectors. Certain industries continue to grow steadily, for example, pharmaceuticals, food industry, public catering, and tourism. Contrastingly, a number of sectors are registering a decline in output, like metallurgy and coal production. The situation in those industries is not so much attributed to tight monetary policy effects as to the worsening of the external environment and lower export opportunities. Overall, industries that are mostly focused on domestic demand are performing better. The expansion of consumer demand sped up somewhat in Q3 25. In part, this was associated with the fact that people were buying more cars in anticipation of a rise in the vehicle recycling fee. As for investment demand, we can say that it stays at the high level it has reached earlier. This is evidenced by business surveys. The situation here is also uneven across sectors and companies. Last year's strong economic overheating gradually subsides. This is happening due to more moderate demand dynamics as compared to 2024, coupled with an ongoing expansion of companies' production capacities. However, certain indicators show that this process still remains unfinished, particularly the indicators of labor market tightness, including historically low unemployment levels and growth of wages outpacing that of labor productivity. Nevertheless, we are registering some signs of an easing in the labor market. When discussing key rate decisions, we traditionally pay attention to companies' financial resilience. Their profits are going down, with the process being uneven across sectors, while businesses' overall financial position remains stable. The Bank of Russia's regional branches conduct regular surveys of 15,000 enterprises across Russia. We are recording the worsening of the financial position of small and medium-sized enterprises. This sector is the most vulnerable to cooling demand, rising taxes, and high interest rates. We take into account the situation in the real economy when making key rate decisions. According to our estimates, the phase of economic overheating will come to an end in H1 26. Considering its actual dynamics, we have lowered the GDP growth forecast for 2025 to 0.5-1%. Over the next years, GDP growth will accelerate. Thirdly, monetary conditions. Overall, they have barely changed, remaining tight. In July-August, interest rates in the economy were going down due to monetary policy easing. By October, this decline stopped. This was associated with expectations of a more gradual easing of monetary policy, as well as new fiscal parameters and the reassessment of risks. Corporate lending growth has sped up in recent months as compared to H1 25. In the updated forecast, we have raised the estimate of the corporate loan portfolio expansion for 2025 to 10-13%. The retail lending forecast has been kept unchanged. Overall, lending to the economy will grow by 8 to 11% this year. The deposit market has, for the most part, completed its adjustment to the key rate decisions made earlier. A number of banks have revised deposit rates upwards following their substantial decline in the summer. Households' saving activity generally remains high. This creates prerequisites for disinflation. Briefly about external conditions. The global economy continues to slow down, albeit more smoothly than expected. We have made minor adjustments to the forecast of oil prices for 2025, taking into account their actual dynamics. The forecast for subsequent years has been left unchanged. The ruble has strengthened somewhat since the previous meeting, which may, to a great extent, be attributed to tight monetary policy effects. High interest rates make assets in rubles more attractive than foreign ones. The ruble appreciation has also been driven by one-off factors. In particular, demand for foreign currency has been lower than at the beginning of autumn, when some companies were accumulating it to repay loans. Given these trends, we have kept the forecast of the balance of payments virtually unchanged. I will now speak of risks. The ratio of risk is still shifted towards pro-inflationary ones. Risks associated with inflation expectations persist. There is uncertainty about the extent to which rising prices for petrol, elevated rates of the utility tariff indexation, and increasing taxes will translate into expectations. Although these are one-off factors of price growth, if they lead to an additional rise in inflation expectations, second-round effects on inflation will be stronger. Current pro-inflationary risks also include lending growth acceleration at a rate higher than forecast by the Bank of Russia and rising labor shortages. Furthermore, risks to oil prices have increased. The global oil market has shifted to a surplus. This might have a significant impact on prices. For Russia, the situation will be additionally complicated by the sanctions. There is a persisting uncertainty related to geopolitics. Everything will depend on how the situation develops. Finally, regarding our future decisions. In recent months, new factors have emerged that will notably impact inflation over the next few quarters. The adjustment of companies' markets and the entire economy to these factors will take time. So far, the balance of factors requires a higher than expected key rate path to ensure a sustainable return of inflation to the target. In the updated forecast, we have raised the key rate range for 2026 to 13-15%, which will make it possible to achieve our 4% inflation target and keep inflation at this level further on. Thank you for your attention. Thank you. Now, dear colleagues, over to your questions. Don't please forget to identify yourself and name your agency. Rita, in the first row, please. Thank you, Richard Bileski, TASS Agency. Elvira Sahib Zadran, how one can characterize the potential for the future reduction of the key rate at the subsequent meetings, and traditionally, what were the options that you considered today Thank you for your questions. Our forecast, if you take a look at the path of the key rate, including for this year, also has the possibility of an additional reduction during the December meeting, as well as remaining unchanged. I would draw your attention to the fact that the signal that the board of directors is sending for the next meeting is a neutral one, which means that continuing to reduce the rate hasn't been defined by default. Now, our decision for the next reduction of the key rate will require additional factors which shall confirm that one can move forward without the risk of the sustainable inflation getting stuck above the target level in 2026. I think this is the most important thing to consider when making our decision. Now, what have been the options that we've reviewed? On a substantive side of things, 3 options, 16, 16.5, and the unchanged rate of 17%. Now, differences in approaches. I mean, there have been quite a few arguments with regard to these decisions, but the differences in attitudes could be brought down to the assessment of the sustainable inflation and the level of concern over the scale of possible secondary effects from the one-off pro-inflationary factors. We all do observe them, but indeed, to be able to evaluate what kind of secondary round effects may happen is quite cumbersome. So those who spoke in favor of a more significant reduction believe that the cooling down of the demand is comparatively quickly will push the sustainable inflation down to the target level, and that the effect of one-off pro-inflationary factors upon the inflation expectation is not going to be significant. Now, those who spoke in favor of keeping it as it was, on the contrary, believe that the sustainable price decline hasn't yet gone down to 4% level, and quite possibly currently remains closer to 6% without any significant reduction to be expected over the past few months. And our colleagues who spoke in favor of keeping the key rate unchanged are afraid that the impact of the one-off factors against the background when the overheating of the demand hasn't yet been exhausted and the high inflation expectations are not anchored, could be more pronounced, more extended over time than in a situation when this combination of pro-inflationary one-off factors could manifest itself against the low inflation and the balanced growth. So the way they see it, we need additional level of prudence when making our additional steps to introduce any further easing. If I may, just a few more comments. Raising the VAT in 2019 was taking place against the backdrop of low inflation expectations and low inflation. Dear colleagues, next one, Sergey, please. Sergei Bolotov, the Russian Gazette, could you please tell us whether new sanctions, the US sanctions, European sanctions, will influence the inflation and the Bank of Russia key rate decisions, and if positive, what kind of mechanisms they may demonstrate? Well, we do see that the sanctions are aiming for restricting the exports of our commodities to predict precisely the way these sanctions may play out. Hardly anybody can do that, but we are looking at it as a certain negative external factor. A lot shall depend upon the way the adaptation to the sanctions may take place, because we know about the previous periods that takes time, but the adjustment has always been playing itself out. So in the meantime, to be able to say that this might require any change within the monetary policy decisions, no. But we will take a look at the way things are going to unfold. Next one, Maria, please. Maria Filushina, Bitkogan. Over the past 3 years, the Bank of Russia has been confronted by one of pro-inflationary shocks. As a result of it, it is in a stable way not possible to achieve the inflation target. Does the Bank of Russia believe that these shocks are somehow correlated? What is the reason behind them? And should we expect similar pro-inflationary shocks in the future? I mean, the ones that are not currently reflected in your forecast. Well, the shocks are exactly the shocks that they are happening in many ways unexpected. unexpectedly. I mean, we take into account, considering our risks that they may happen. Indeed, there's been quite a few of them. And the central bank may not react to these shocks if they're one-off, they're temporary, they're on the side of supply, as long as they don't have the secondary effects and impact upon the inflation expectations, and through them affecting the consumers' behaviors, either to consume more or to save more. So such secondary effects may happen, and because the one-off factors like we see now are juxtaposed upon each other, such secondary effects may become significant. That is why you have to account for them, and that is one of the reasons as to why we raised the key rate path, because that was a big part of our deliberations. I mean, the effects coming from these one-off shocks and how might they impact these expectations and the secondary round effects as well. The next question comes from Vladivostok, Andrei Pushkarov, the Russian Gazette. There is a bit of a feeling that the inflation is being impacted by any kind of factors, but not the key rate. What if one could try and radically reduce the key rate, at least until the end of the year, down to 15, not to 12% even? Well, let's imagine that the central bank, despite the inflationary risk and the inflation dynamics, so we bring down the rate to 12%. What might happen? Firstly, the demand for loans will grow. Everybody's going to run head over heels for them, and that would spike the demand. But the supply of goods and services in the market cannot grow as fast because all of the resources to expand output, specifically in the area of labor, has already been exhausted. And the result is quite evident. Inflation very quickly will rise to 12%. And what does it mean? Because if with that the key rate remains even 12%, there's going to be an avalanche-like process because the real rate is going to be negative, which will push the lending and the demand much faster forward. The price is going to grow very quickly, and so the inflation will not only remain high, month in, month out, it will start accelerating, and the experience in other countries very eloquently demonstrate, you can even recall our experience from 1990s, that it very quickly leads to a spiraling inflation, even hyperinflation. This is exactly the way the inflationary spiral behaves, and I would like to underscore everywhere and all the time. Besides, what we need to keep in mind is that if the demand grows, then the demand for imported products will also grow, because the willingness to save in rubles is going to diminish because the rates are not going to compensate for inflation, which might mean that the exchange rate will depreciate. And as a result, the domestic products, the imported products will be less available, and in the end of the day, that will deal a blow to the citizens' well-being. You will have to fight inflation anyway, but, pursuing tougher measures, much tougher. Nastya, please. Anastasia Savilieva, Interfax. Well, we understood everything from your statement, apart from why exactly you have decided to reduce the rate, and do you believe the 50 basis points to be just symbolic, so as to balance out any statements that people might hear in your release, and how one should consider the dynamics? Because the people in September, despite the price growth in vegetables area and petrol and the possible VAT rise, have changed by the observed inflation. On the contrary, went down. I mean, let me try and do it again, why we reduced the key rate, so as to run down the list of factors which, even though with the moderate steps, but nevertheless pushed us towards reducing and easing our monetary policy, because we believe that we are, whatever you might consider, are going through the easing cycle, because such periods may be taken with basic intervals, but what we forecast for the next year is to continue more prudently, but to ease the monetary policy. Why is it possible? Because we see that the overheating of the demand side of things is evaporating, and so in the first half next year, we expect that the gap you see with the demand is going to be closed, and that basically anticipates our basic forecast, our baseline forecast, and therefore we are of the opinion that one can move forward, but more cautiously, once again, because of a great number of temporary pro-inflationary factors which might bring around this big secondary round effects. And the situation in the labour market, why cautious? Because the tension in the labour market remains, but why one can still do the easing? Because the tension in the labour market has demonstrated becoming easier. We certainly don't have the recent statistical data, they come a bit later in, but we have the data from our surveys and what the headhunters are showing. We see that the number of vacancies is getting reduced, and the number of businesses which experience labour shortages, although the number of thereof is remaining high, but nevertheless there is a very well observed trend. And now about the inflationary expectations, why they have remained unchanged? I will ask Mr. Zabotkin to speak about the factors which may have brought them around. Please. Well, this is something that you should ask about those who are being surveyed, but I would say that, amongst other things, this is the reflection of the process of the current price dynamics slowing down. In other marker products, not the ones that have shot upwards, within a certain number of categories, and definitely the households show that the price growth rate in the second half of this year is lower than they experienced in the first half and last year. But I would like to say that the level of inflation expectations remains within the range that we saw them back in 2024, and they are above the range of 2023, because back in 2023 and 2024, inflation, if you remember, was a high one. So keeping inflation expectation at that level definitely cannot be perceived as some sort of rainbow effect, but the fact that they haven't grown is a positive occurrence. Thank you. Artyom? Good afternoon, Artyom Gorin, Invest Future. I have two questions. What is your take on the influence of VAT rise with the recycling fee? Because Alexei Borisovich already mentioned that the expected one is going to be 7.6% around, but considering the vehicle recycling fee, would it affect the monetary policy? And up till the recent times, we saw that it has been moving, but how it may affect the Russian economy and the monetary policy that the Bank of Russia may pursue further. Thank you. Let me start with an important general statement. To precisely estimate the impact of every one-off factor upon inflation is quite cumbersome, particularly if they don't coincide in time, like VAT and the vehicle recycling fee. Why, with regard to VAT, we were able to give a pinpoint assessment? Because we used to have an experience of raising VAT by 2%, and at that time there was no pro-inflationary factor playing around it. So bearing in mind the fact that we've already had such experience, that was 0.6, 0.7, now we're counted to be 0.8. Why? Because we still went through a certain change in the accrual methodology with regard to the small businesses, amongst other considerations. So we came up with 0.7, 0.8. A lot will depend upon the secondary effects, because this time they can become stronger than back in 2019. Now, direct assessment of the impact from the vehicle recycling fee makes it a difficult exercise, but we also think that the vehicle recycling fee definitely in its effect is going to be weaker than that from VAT. Now, as far as oil prices are concerned, the oil price fluctuations that are currently being observed do not significantly affect our policy and our decisions making. Why? Because everybody has grown used to the oil prices being an important factor. Well, firstly, because these fluctuations are taking place close to what we've forecasted, something that was in our baseline forecast. And secondly, and that is more important fundamentally, is the fiscal rule effect, because the fiscal rule essentially neutralizes the negative effect of this oil price fluctuations upon our economy. It takes on, if not all, then the lion's share of such a volatility. Well, I mean, it's true, not 100%. So against very strong fluctuations of oil price changes with, let's say, deviations of dozens of percent from our forecast, its impact upon the economy and inflation will definitely come from high prices, disinflationary effect, from low prices, pro-inflationary effect, and that is something that we'll definitely take into account in our monetary policy. But currently, it is not happening. And another important addition, speaking about the oil prices, this kind of mechanics that I was talking about, the neutralization of the oil price effect, in the meantime, is working. And in the National Welfare Fund, there's enough resources in order to neutralize it, in order to compensate for the falling out of oil and gas income. So if these resources are exhausted, then the fiscal rule effect as an insurance against the temporary price decline are going to be exhausted. So with this in mind, we are very much greeting and welcoming what the government has plans to gradually reduce the cutoff price, because it will help longer term to defend, to more soundly protect the economy and the fiscal system from the oil price fluctuations within this scenario where the long-term oil price may fall below $60 per barrel. Mr. Zabotkin, please. Yes. With your permission, I would like to further elaborate on the assessment of the one-off factors effect. In what way econometrics work? It enables to segregate the one-off factors. I mean, the changing of prices that are impossible to attribute to the demand side factors. So it's going to be one-off factors on the supply side. So this kind of an analysis, specifically, we are even putting together the charts, for it. But that exercise makes it possible to identify the aggregate contribution of such one-off factors, because you've got several playing out at a time. To itemize them distinctly from each other is a difficult thing to do because they interact with each other. So the overall contribution of the one-off factors, once they persevere through the January, we definitely will be able to say about how much comes from the VAT, how much comes from the vehicle recycling fee, how much from the oil price lag dynamics. It would be not easy to do. Yana, next one, please. Thank you. Yana Churachkina, RIA Novosti. The gold reserves in the international reserve side in Russia for the first time during the 18 months period have grown. What is the reason behind it? I mean, that comes from the central bank statistics. Well, I believe this could be because of a reevaluation, because of the gold price growth. In US dollars, definitely from growing prices, because certain shifts in the physical volumes, they are related to the transportation and the move of gold between us and the treasury. Well, maybe they will give us something back. Next question comes from St. Petersburg Online. Lilia Bartrishina. 78.ru internet publications. The current appreciation of ruble, many experts describing as unexpected and unpleasant to the country's fiscal system. Does the central bank find it a concern, and will it in any way affect your future decisions about the key rate? A quick answer. The appreciation of the ruble exchange rate is a logical effect coming from a tough monetary policy. This is a exchange rate reaction to the monetary policy measures, and certainly the exchange rate impacting the way it impacts the economy and the budget is something that we do reflect in our decisions. But I would like to share with you a few additional considerations. And first of all, remind you that the exchange rate is floating, the market pegged one, And that is the result from many, many factors like export opportunities, import demand, the households' demand for foreign assets, the foreigners' demand for the Russian assets, although this factor has diminished in its significance. And so the exchange rate effectively balances all of these factors out in terms of their impact upon the economy. This year, the exchange rate is stronger than last year. But I would also like to note that one should compare it with the average exchange rate in 2024, because throughout the past 3 years, it has been really wobbling about. And so appreciation against the last year's exchange rate, 30%. And that reflects objective effects of resulting from the tough monetary policy. That reflects the currency channel, because this is the channel is effectively without inflation. But by the by, if you switch this channel off, like some propose, which would bring us into a directive control of the exchange rate and artificially resist the exchange rate appreciation, then in order to bring inflation down, one would require a high level of the key rate. And this is something that one must comprehend. So something that I would like to draw attention to. Maybe we were oblivious of it in the past, but I believe this is important. Apart from the imports and exports, the capital flows, and our monetary policy, currently the exchange rate is being impacted upon by the structural factor. Structural is not temporary, it's not market-based, it's not related to the monetary policy. So these structural factors push the exchange rate towards the appreciation compared to the pre-2022 situation. Now, what are these? Import restrictions, domestic, external one, domestic one, like the import substitution, protectionism, localization requirements, that is the need to procure domestically made products. Objectively, that would play the import down, will push it down. Against all other things being equal, that would make the share of imports in GDP smaller. And so one must understand that as a result, that would make the exchange rate stronger. And if there are many measures like that, then the effect coming out of it could be also a huge one. Now, the second long-term factor is the households' demand for foreign currencies, securities, foreign industrial assets going down because of the sanctional risks and restrictions. So you need to understand it as well. And the third, higher cut-off price within the fiscal rule, because essentially that means a more active utilization of the oil and gas rent, which also structurally leads to a stronger real exchange rate. And the last point about the budget, because the budget requires low inflation, not less than the businesses and the households do, because you should agree, you hardly likely can describe this as a pleasant thing when, because of the high inflation, you continuously have to index the expenditures, and when you see the interest that you pay in order to service your debt is continuously growing, because that also generates a negative impact upon the fiscal system. Thank you. Next, Natasha. Natalia Trushina, the Moscow Komsomolets. I've got the following question. Obviously, the Ministry of Finance is trying to eliminate the budget deficit. Because of that, back in September, Russian parliamentarians suggested that a tax should be imposed upon the super profits of the bank at about 10%, back at which they say they would need to pay before the 1st of January next year. So what do you think about it, considering the fact that the banking sector this year, despite all the sanctions, is going to enjoy the profit of 3 to 3.5 billion rubles as assessed by the regulator? So how closing the budget can affect the key rate and the diminishing budget deficit? So what generally do you think about such initiatives? Well, of course, that won't bring around any good thing for the economy. It won't reduce the key rate as a result. On the contrary. Why? Because it seems to me it is very important to understand the specifics of the way the banks operate and the way they use their profits, like in other sectors, the bigger part of the banking profit is allocated into investments. It's just that we don't describe it investments. We describe it as capital. In different industries, investments are spent on equipment, machinery. In the banking system, they replenish their capital. What do we need it for, particularly when all of the external sources are cut off? It is the capital which makes it possible to expand lending into the economy. So essentially, every ruble taken out of the capital is reducing the lending potential by 10 rubles. Elementary. So let's take a look at how this profit is being used. We already have data for the first 9 months. The banks received 2.7 trillion rubles. The capital grew by 1.7 trillion rubles. Throughout this period, the banks transferred into the fiscal system 800 billion in taxes, additional 500 billion, half a trillion ruble, in the form of dividends to the government banks for 2024. We need not to forget that the bigger number of banks are the government-owned banks, and so they allocate their dividends into the fiscal system. So, yes, and the banks, like everybody, are going to pay a higher profit tax. However, the super profit tax will basically lead to the potential going down. Not only that, but it would be impossible then for them to lend to the economy. All right, the next one. Elena, please. Elena Fabrichner, Reuters. You were speaking about the influence from the sanctions upon the key rate that it comes from the external negative factor. But if you assess their impact upon the ruble exchange rate, might it not happen that these oil companies that are being sanctioned right now will quickly start converting their hard currency reserves, and that would bring about a more stronger ruble exchange rate? We do not see such a risk. We do not see it. Dear colleagues, Misha, please. Mikhail Maseyev, Frank Media. Yesterday, the general director of the Deposit Insurance Agency was arrested, the chairman of the board of directors of the agency. How can you comment this? Have you dismissed Andrei Melnikov from his position? Are you considering any substitution? I'm not ready to comment on this at this point in time. Thank you. The next question comes online from the city of Abakan. Could you introduce yourself, please? Good afternoon. Viktor Lebedev, Khakassia, a Republican newspaper. The Siberian Sworn Telegram channel. I've got the following question. In October, across the country, we are seeing the price grow for the diesel fuel and gasoline. In Khakassia, we really feel it quite strongly. And whenever the lubricants and fuel grow in price, the inflation expectations do follow suit, and so households feel concerned. Does the central bank take into account these concerns in any of the industries or sectors when making your decision about the key rate? Another question I have, which other topics do you believe are quite sensitive to the household in terms of their inflation expectations? A very good question, actually. The one that is related to the inflationary one-off factors. Of course, we take into account the situation with the refined products, because that takes up quite a huge share in the consumer basket, 4.4%. Actually, it's quite sizable. And we do ascertain that there is an excessive price growth within the current period compared to the average path that it should have followed if it were in an ordinary seasonal dynamics. Just direct contribution from the gasoline price growth through this share of the basket is 0.4%, but there is also an indirect effect that we've described. Gasoline and the diesel fuel, an important cost factor in transportation company, although it manifests itself gradually. This is, although not direct, but indirect effect. The same growing cost factor in spending on gasoline pushes up the businesses' inflation expectations. Not only that, but also amongst the household, because looking at the prices nudging up for gasoline, I mean, people become worrying that prices for all the rest of the things are going to grow as well, and that might, instigate the price growth for a broader range of products and services, like what we described, the secondary effects, the secondary round effects, which are difficult to estimate in advance, but we believe that this may happen. And so if the secondary round effects are high, and if the inflation expectations continue to grow, then the key rate must be higher, and we will take this into account in our future decision making. Gasoline, undoubtedly, is one of the marker products. We call it the marker indicator products, marker products, the kind of products looking at which people, they basically make their opinion about inflation. If you look at what are the other things that people react to, like everyday staples, bread, milk, eggs, utility tariffs as well, certainly. So the price is growing for these products, even if they have been brought about by some temporary reasons, could translate into the inflation expectations becoming high. So we are monitoring it very closely, and we discuss all of these things when making a decision about the key rate. Rita, next one, please. Margarita Mordovina, RBK. In your release covering the October board meetings, you stated that the disinflationary budget effect is going to be less pronounced than what you noted beforehand. But even 1 month ago, you said that our budget is disinflationary. So could you please tell us what has happened over the past 4 weeks, which made you change your look at it? I would ask Mr. Zabotkin to comment. Our assessment of the deficit for this year has grown. But at the same time, we continue to believe that this is a disinflationary kind of a budget, but this disinflationary impact is less pronounced. Well, it's very difficult for me to add anything on top of it, because whatever we said a month ago doesn't contradict what we were saying today, because disinflationary budget effect this year turned out to be weaker, but it remains to be disinflationary anyway. Dear colleagues, Nikita? Good afternoon, Nikita Mitrofanov, Economical Telegram Channel. Today I came to you with a question and proposal, and I would like to further continue on the topic. What would have happened if the key rate was brought down almost halved? Because this kind of conversation, particularly among the politicians, have been going on over the past 2 years. Somehow it is believed that all the problems of this country come from the key rate, and so if we sit into the economics rocket and will fly somewhere, but nobody knows where. So not only what you're mentioning during your press conferences, I mean how bad an idea this is, but also to introduce certain changes in your analytical assessment why that could be a bad idea, because people get agitated and they quickly forget things. But if there is some sort of an instrument at hand, that would increase the level of transparency of the monetary policy in the minds of the household. People would know why this key rate is this and what would have happened amongst the bad things if it was different. Thank you very much for your good idea and your question, because indeed this question is an important one, because there are simply myths and a certain understanding that if the key rate is being brought down, the inflation is also going to be will go down, and the economic activity will grow. Somehow our past experience is not being taken into account, because we really don't want this country to go through this whole experience like, oops, I did it again. This is definitely something that must not be allowed. But you are quite right that this kind of logic is what we need to speak more about. We'll think about, putting more of it into our analytical materials, although, to put it mildly, not all ordinary people read it, just the experts. But thanks very much to our media colleagues who are paying attention to it, because on our side, we're doing our best to try and explain this logic, and we'll definitely continue doing so. Mrs. Zabotkin, maybe you would say something. What else should we need to do? Because all of your proposals are quite welcome. Yes, we do everything that so far we have come up with. But thank you very much for this idea. But on a serious note, an honest and very eloquent tool is a model-based tool that we have uploaded on the website of the Bank of Russia, and basically anybody who can try and learn how to do it and what kind of data it may be put into it, and you can see the way things may play itself out in sort of different scenarios. Although one thing that we haven't yet come up to is how to make it available to simple people. It's not such a bad idea, to somehow produce some sort of a gaming kind of a model so that people could understand what kind of future they might have in store for them. Evgeny Grachov is listing newspaper. One of the key problems of the monetary policy is high inflation expectations. Could you please tell us what is the scenario that the Bank of Russia might see could be followed in order to solve this problem? Is it true that in case that is possible, then you could be more active in bringing down the key rate? The only reliable way to reduce the inflation expectation is to reach stable inflation at a lower rate, because only when people see that the prices in shops don't continuously grow, whatever we say otherwise, people will still keep high inflation expectations. So it's of principal importance for us to continue bringing inflation down. But you're absolutely correct. For the reduction and making the inflation expectations anchored at lower levels would enable us to act quicker in reducing the key rate. Mr. Zabotkin, and I would also say that if the inflation expectations are low and anchored, that is a much stronger kind of a prerequisite, because they become anchored one in a few years' time after they go down. If they're low and anchored, then the central bank doesn't have to so actively respond with a key rate to short-term inflation fluctuations in order to maintain inflation at a lower level further on, because the lower and the stronger anchored the inflation expectations, then less of the meddling with the monetary policy tools are required. The next question comes from Anna Gromova online. Anna Finance. Good afternoon. In the financially authorized person, in terms of the unacceptable practices, there is such an information. The banks are selling the credit insurance with a big markup, specifying a specific situation when the bank sold the policy for 400,000 rubles, but paid to the insurance company only 340. In different cases are being mentioned. Does the central bank have any plans to be more strict in making sure that the households are not overpaying the insurance policies for that particular requirement? You're quite right that the households must not overpay for the services that do not offer any consumer value. But the problem that you are mentioning is an old one, but one must say that the situation is gradually improving, because we do see various grievances over it. Almost 1.5 times the number of them has gone down. Individual banks started imposing very tough requirements upon the quality of their insurance products. We are welcoming it very much. The kind of insurance products which are being accepted as the securitization of lending. And such requirements do include a broad insurance coverage with a minimum number of reasons to reject payment, because people are complaining specifically about their payment requests within the insurance policy being rejected. So to minimize the number of reasons as to why they may be refused to be paid, a faster payment procedure if the insurance claim is registered. So we do note a certain positive practice among certain banks, which gives us the reason to believe that other banks might start offering to their customers insurance products based on normal terms, because the banks are fighting to retain their customers. Another thing that I would very much welcome to resolve this problem is that the marketplace themselves have come up with an initiative to develop a standard for a self-regulated organization status. We have even responded to them with our ideas about the structure and the standard, but the standards should be adopted only by self-regulated organizations themselves. And so the directional thing in it is going to be like I'm describing, to reduce the reasons to reject such claims, to eliminate the disbalances between the agency commissions and fees and the insurance policy premiums. And so we hope that the marketplace are going to come up with the final proposal before the end of the year. Dear colleagues, another questions? Jacob, please. Good afternoon. Jacob Simakov, Expert Magazine. Elvira Nabiullina, on the one hand, the Bank of Russia has supported the decision to raise the VAT rate in this way to reduce the budget deficit, but on the other hand, you do acknowledge this is a pro-inflation decision. You mentioned it today with different effects. But at the same time, we hear a conversation that the central bank is going to be more tolerant towards the target, and you're not saying it. So isn't there a discrepancy? One, would you say that the inflation expectation might translate itself into the higher prices and wage growth this year before the taxation comes into effect? Well, indeed, we spoke about it in the past, because short-term effect from higher taxation could be a pro-inflationary factor, but from the point of view of a mid-term outlook, raising taxes is more preferable than allowing the budget deficit to grow and more borrowing, because otherwise that would have been more pro-inflationary and for a much longer period into the future. So this option we thought was more desirable. Now, in as far as the VAT effect is concerned, once it will start transiting into prices and how strongly it might happen, we will see it shortly. But the basic thing, considering the 2019 experience, is going to happen in December, January. I guess this is the way. Would you add something? No. Okay. Next question comes online from Murmansk, from Oksana Sidova. B-Port online publication, please. Yeah, good afternoon, Oksana Sidova, B-Port Information Agency from Murmansk. Some of the experts are saying that the high key rate in the course of 3 years has put the country onto the verge of economic crisis, while the economy is experiencing deep freezing rather than overheating. Well, we disagree with this particular point of view. To say that the economy is overcooled too strongly is possible only if there's unemployment growth, the real wages are going down. That's not the case. The situation is radically different. We've got a record low unemployment. We have high wage growth, which continues. Yes, there are industries where demand has gone down. In the first place, these are the export-dependent industries, but the root of the problems there finds itself in a totally different area than the key rate. Reduction of employment and the utilization of capacities going down in itself is not something that proves overcooling if the unemployment remains at a record low level. Actually, just to be fair, let's talk figures. I shall remind you that the average rate back in 2022, the average key rate, was 10.6%. The GDP went by 1.4%. In 2023, the key rate was approximately the same, 10%, 10.6, 10%. Growth, 4.1%. In 2024, the average key rate already was 17.5%. The GDP growth was 4.3%. So there you are. I don't want to say that there is no correlation between the key rate and the economic growth, additional inflation factor, but this is much more complicated compared to some commentators are inclined to believe, because, the key rate can be used to push up the nominal growth and up to any value, but if all of the working hands in the economy are busy, then the only notable result is an outcome of such a spiraling demand which doesn't pay any heed to the production capacities, and that is trying to skyrocket without taking into account inflation. It's going to be just a galloping inflation, nothing else. Thank you very much, dear colleagues. Julia, please.
Julia Rastorgova, market power. What is the way that the Bank of Russia can explain such a considerable difference in the ruble mass dynamics M2 and the broad money mass, which is M2X, in September? Thank you very much. I would ask Mr. Zabotkin to give you an answer. Well, first of all, the money aggregates is something that you better look not with a 1 month lag, but through a more continuous time frame, because that would give you better information as to the possible impact of the money aggregate dynamics and its influence upon inflation. However, if you basically look at the September statistics narrowly, and if you take a look at the structure of the sources of broad money mass growth, a big contribution came from net foreign assets in different credit institutions, which means, on the money mass components, the currency deposits of different businesses have grown, which basically shows that in September, there took place the inflow of currency deposits belong to various legal entities, which before that had been kept in the foreign banks. Now they are in the Russian banks. Also, that includes various expectations towards the foreign debt currency payments. Nikita, next one. Nikita Prokofiev, Pro-Finance. The analysts, including those in the bigger banks, are making forecasts and saying that in case this special military operation is over, the exchange rate may appreciate to 40, 50. But the Minister of Economic Development believes that the exchange rate at 70 rubles is a strategic threat to the economy. Does the central bank believe it to be a real threat, or that could be, or otherwise, on the contrary, the economic benefit? Any scenario which speaks about an improvement of external environment will be a disinflationary one, which will promote us towards acting faster in reducing the key rate. The ruble is going to adjust to it, but it will definitely appreciate itself. Yeah, maybe I will say the same thing, but from a different angle. What the improvement in the external conditions mean? It means that we will be able to buy more of imports against the level of exports, which would mean that the economy will be able to satisfy a higher level of its needs without pushing inflation upwards. And in this sense, this is a disinflationary factor. And the key rate can become lower because it would enable one to enjoy a broader level of free demand. Thank you very much, dear colleagues. Are there any questions left? Nastya, please. The central bank has revoked a license from the Tavritsky banks. Why do you believe that it was not possible to administer it into a good status during the past 10 years? And what do you think about the hole in its capital amounting to 135 billion rubles, which is much higher than in the Yugra Bank? Well, the reason behind it came from an aggregation of different factors, amongst them the consequence of the bank's business model being closely packed to the Eurobonds. And this business model didn't have any risk before 2022, and because of the sanctions, the negative revaluation took place of those kinds of securities, which in the first place were in the form of the Eurobonds. And as far as the big hole is concerned, and the possibility in the first place to meet the demands of the creditors, this is something that we're more concerned for. So our assessment do show that if one is to sell the bank's assets during the insolvency procedures, the demands from the first and second tier of creditors will be fully closed. And so after all of the creditors' expectations are met, then in January 2026, the story is going to be closed. Well, I do see, colleagues, that there are more questions coming. Natasha, please. Yes, I got one more question. Could you please tell us, does the Bank of Russia estimate the influence of the geopolitics upon the ruble exchange rate? Because in October, the ruble has been behaving paradoxically, for example, in the beginning of the month, against no positive news being there. And whenever talking about the tomahawks, it is appreciated. But at the same time, when we hear the news about the possible meeting between Trump and Putin in Budapest and the construction of an infrastructure in Alaska together with Americans, it starts depreciating. Is there any dependence? And can one somehow estimate it in order to be able to explain this to the investors? Well, I can repeat to you the words I've already mentioned previously, because there are several fundamental factors which impact the exchange rate. Exports and imports and capital flows, and you see the dynamics thereof. And there is the monetary policy that is currently works towards making ruble stronger, but also there are short-term factors as well. So one must acknowledge that our exchange rate has become more volatile, and depending upon the combination of these different factors, it may react to them in different ways at the same time. Yeah. Mrs. Zabotkin, could you please also say something if you think you can add something? I wanted simply to highlight such a thing that we're staying within and comparably unchanged. Yeah, and actually you have to take a look not at the short-term fluctuations, but you should analyze a longer period of time. And these fluctuations are taking place within the specific range. Yeah, we find ourselves within the kind of range that has been around for more than 6 months, since May. And that is the lower threshold of that range that the exchange rate used to have since the middle of 23. I mean, the lower threshold from the point of view of the US dollars and rubles denominated. But once again, I shall repeat by saying that we continue to remind people that if our monetary policy is aimed at achieving lower inflation, then automatically it protects the purchasing power of the national currency, not only in relationship to goods and services, but similarly, actually, in relationship to other foreign currencies, all the way to the strong external shocks that may alter the situation considerably, but the exchange rate stability is the consequence of the policy targeting lower inflation. That's the only way. All right, thank you very much, Rita. Margarita Bordovina, RBK. As of September 1st, the lending cooling period has come into effect. As of October 1st, in the banking apps, it became possible to complain about the fraudsters. Does the central bank have any preliminary assessment of how effective these measures are? How many people have used it? And basically, how is it working out? Well, certainly, without doubt, we are conducting the monitoring of the way such measures are working. In the meantime, we are not just ready to give you any quantitative assessment. Once we do have them, we will share them with you. Thank you, dear colleagues. Please, Julia. Julia Rastorgova, Market Power. Over the past few months, we've seen the currency-denominated credits growing. In the banks of Russia, noted on more than one occasion that the lending growth is an important indicator. Theoretically, a longer period where the key rate is at a higher level may incentivize such lending activities. So what do you think about it? We don't see this being any express kind of a trend. In order to be able to say that people prefer ruble-denominated credits to the currency-denominated one, yes, you need to reduce inflation faster, because that is what our policy is aiming for. But in terms of there being any systemic problem where people are switching in between the ruble credits into currency credits, because it's the ruble-denominated lending has been accelerating over the past few months when we were registering the corporate lending becoming more active. Thank you very much. Mikhail, please, yes, go ahead. Mikhail Moiseev, Frank Media. Not so long ago, the Deputy Minister of Finance, Alexei Moiseev, said that about 60% of the customers who enter into the long-term pension savings contract are pensioners and pre-pensioners. Do you see any problem here? Something that may require the intention of the regulator? I mean, from the point of view of mis-selling, that product, I assume, originally hasn't been put together for the pensioners. We're not registering any sort of a mis-selling, but we will definitely monitor it. But I believe that people who are senior, they have a greater awareness of the need to have long-term savings, for when they grow older. I mean, in a certain way, this is a natural thing, but we'll definitely look out for it if there are any distortions. But we haven't ascertained any. Dear colleagues, our time is coming up. The last question, Sergey, please. Sergei Bolotov, the Russian Gazette. Just recently, the housing market was entertaining a hope that the next year the key rate is going to go down to the level of about 10%, maybe even lower, and so the mortgage will become, lending will become more accessible. Now this hope is not so, pronounced. Could you please tell us, are there not going to be any shocks in the housing market? I mean, will the developers be able to continue doing the good thing they do if the key rate is not going down so quickly? Well, to expect the key rate to be at 10%, there was no reason to expect it to be that way, because we have been publishing our forecast of the key rate and the one that we expect it to be in the medium range. I mean, the recent one that we have come up with was at 12 to 13%. But I would like to tell you that the housing market is becoming more active these days. We do see that the share of the market-based mortgage lending is not a big one, but even that has started growing once the monetary conditions have been eased. And so, with regard to the financing made available by the developers themselves, there's a special mechanism in place with the escrow accounts, and so they get credits at relatively lower price at about 10%, at about 11% at this point in time. So mortgage lending is recovering. Not only, like I said, because of the housing market, because the share of the housing being sold at own expense and the share of the mortgage loan being repaid in installments has become bigger. So it's about 1% a month that the mortgage lending has been growing. And it's a well-balanced, I believe, a well-balanced rate of growth. Dear colleagues, thank you so much for your interest and for your interesting questions.